The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Huw, Rich, and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hey Rich, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Yourself?
Good. Have you managed to think of a title for this magnificent series of podcasts we're going to be doing yet?
Oh, without any preparation, that's a difficult question. It's a difficult first
Exactly.
question.
You can see that we're very well prepared when we're piling into this. So I've actually come up with a 16-point plan here for today's discussion.
Oh,
wow. No, actually, we're only gonna probably get through 2 or 3 of them, but let's just give it a go. I mean, loosely, it came out of a meeting in a fantastic pub in Oxford called the Bear, where Rich and I basically ranted on for about 3 hours, drank some very nice warm brown beer, and then we thought, wow, this should be a podcast, really. So this is kind of a loose set of podcasts. This first one is going to be kind of a bit general. We're just going to have a little ramble. I tend to be more on the ranting side of things, and Rich tends to be more on the calm, measured, thoughtful. Much pleasanter than me. So hopefully there will be a little dynamics based on that.
We'll start off on that premise.
Then what we've done is we've probably picked out about another 5 or 6 titles that we're going to be interested in, and we're going to bring on guests. I think we'll probably bring on a guest maybe every other week or something like that. If you guys want to just connect with us on LinkedIn and send through any topics you'd like discussed, then that's great. We'll probably start maybe at the end of one. We'll probably outline a few of the potential things we could talk about upcoming, and we may just talk about them in the podcast. So I thought we'd start off with kind of who we are, and once we've kind of gone through that, why we want to put together a set of podcasts about basically the state of the IT industry. I think that's what we can roughly call it. So Rich, why don't you sort of start with kind of your background, where you come from, maybe a little bit about your kind of philosophy.
Yeah, no worries. So Rich Jordan. So I've worked within test for just over 20 years, and for a large portion of that within financial services. I've recently left financial services to come and join Curiosity 3 months ago now. If you go and look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll see I come from Nationwide. It's no point in not kind of going there with the names. Just before leaving, I led the community of practice around test engineering, but I was also involved with creating much of the organisational test strategy and many of the strategies for the individual approaches when it came to testing. I also ran a team called DevOps, as many may have known externally in the industry. That looked at technical testing, so things like data, automation, operations, performance and security. Large amount of variation when it comes to technology, lots of challenges, both technical and societal or personal or political, whichever way you want to tie them up as. So lots of kind of experience and experiences of projects and ways of working that some are optimal, some not quite so much, some aspirational, some kind of snake oil, but the reality is something slightly different. I've actually been working with Huw and in a Prima Life the Grid Tools guy since about 2010, I think it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. And kind of our journey has kind of grown since then together, kind of in parallel, looking at lots and lots of problems that I think typical organizations face, and how do you best face into them to resolve them. Be yourself.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. It's been quite a long time, hasn't it, Rich?
It has indeed.
Exactly. So, and I mean, actually, one of Rich's ideas, which we scribbled on, if you've ever been to Swindon, they've got quite an impressive building down there, and we scribbled it on a lovely white table on a bit of literally on the back of a napkin. And about sort of 3 or 4 weeks later, we came back with something, and then maybe a couple of months later, it was actually implemented. And actually, bizarrely, I was giving a demo to a very large organisation, SI yesterday, where we're showing the sort of version 92 of that napkin. So exactly. Test matching, data allocation, data reservation, allocating data, the correct data to tests. I mean, that was actually kind of a fun project. I think at my heart, I'm a bit of a storyteller, and I've managed to spin that project into a proper Welsh story, that one. So anyway, so let me just tell me a little about myself. So, I am really old, not long before I get my bus pass and even possibly a pension. I've been in the IT industry for nigh on 45 years, basically. So it's always amusing when I go onto a call and say, yeah, I've been in the industry for 7 years, as though that's some kind of magnificent number. And I'm like, yeah, keep going, boy, keep going, girl. So during that time, I mean, I've had a very, very mixed career. So I worked for a very organized company, Eagle Star, actually, which was a really good learning experience. It was very, very, taught me structured programming techniques and discipline, and it actually probably laid the foundation of my kind of approach to software development. Then I went off and worked for an utterly chaotic organization which was a travel agent, which hilariously the software that we developed, which was a thing called Budget Holidays, where we used to test with live data and actually test on the live system and actually move people around at airports and change their flights just for fun. Those are the days. It was from one end to the other. I then moved to America. I worked on Wall Street. I then left, formed my own company, the first of probably about 5 companies. I then worked in the public sector, and actually I think worked for Philadelphia Board of Education, where we were the only project ever in the history of Pennsylvania government to come in on time and on budget. And we actually delivered the system. And I had 50 programmers working for me at that time, so that was kind of fun as well. So I've had lots of experience of actually doing, and since that time I've set up lots of software companies. The premise of most of the software companies is doing things better and faster. So that's why I'm kind of jaded and sort of a little bit fed up in that actually trying to get people to change their behavior and introduce things which make things better is really, really difficult. And we will probably keep coming back to this subject. In that there's lots of torpor in the industry. There's lots of lack of dynamism. There's lots of vested interest where people really don't want to change. I would sort of in a nutshell say that there is so much really cool technology around there at the moment, but the trouble is we've gathered up so much technical debt. There's very poor organizational infrastructure, very poor management. I'm going to say that, 9 out of 10 times I would say it's poor management. 1 out of 10, I'm absolutely thrilled with some of the stuff that's being done. And there've been some actual beacon accounts. So hopefully by telling some stories, we can maybe persuade some of the 9 out of the 10 that it is possible to make change and it is possible to basically go faster. If you look at the current state of the IT industry, most projects are late. They're also way too expensive. I think the cost of IT is ridiculously insane. So I think there's plenty of interesting things to talk about that. Now, I was actually totting it up the other day because, this is Curiosity Software. The previous companies have all been sold, so the software that we've developed over the years has gone off into the market, and it is quite heartening when you wander around and see, that's my software. That's Paul Blundell's software. That's Martin Wheeler's software, and you sort of see it in use. It's all kind of a bit out of date now and a bit dated. But if you kind of look at the amount of software that's been sold, I think I totted it up as probably north of about 300 or 400 million euros worth of software that's been sold that has come basically from the companies that, and we've never had more than about 20, 25 people in a company. So if you think about that effect on the industry, I think that is something. Not many people can say they've written some software which has sold 250 million. So I think that's an interesting sort of thing to be, I guess, proud of. It's been quite hard, I suppose. So Yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of where I've come from. I've also done lots of strategic advice. So that's kind of where Rich and I were always chatting, because I would be going into an organization and saying, look, you've got a really good senior manager here who's one of 7, and he's trying to get some stuff done. How the hell is he going to get, and he's got lots of people who don't want it to happen. First of all, is the other 6 who it's not his or her turn to basically kind of move forward with some new technology. So there's that. There are sometimes vendors in there who are actively fighting against it. And I've got some absolutely classic stories about saying one thing to your face and then seeing the emails behind the scenes, which is always quite amusing. So it's, and then I call up Rich and say, well, do they go centralized? Do they set up a center of excellence, or as some people call it, a center of incompetence? And Rich has always been a good sounding board, because he's actually done it. You've tried it all.
Made all the mistakes.
Yeah, so I know I've done, and we have had a lot of success by coming in and implementing the software. But I think what we're sort of realizing now is that, and that's kind of why we brought Rich into the company, is that we need someone to basically be a kind of even-handed sort of advocate for change, where realizing that there are many different people involved in this, and they're all looking at it from different angles, and we're obviously looking at it from, well, you could save this much money, you could go this much faster, this much quality, it's a no-brainer. But actually, if we can't see it from the organizations and the people in the organization, how are we supposed to then sell, and how are we also supposed to improve? It's fun working with customers, it's fun solving problems. I mean, hopefully that's why most people are in IT, because when it's going well, it's brilliant. You've got a really juicy problem, you all get your heads together, there's this fantastic sense of cooperation, you get stuff going, then you see it delivered, and then you see this stuff comes out and you think, wow, that really didn't exist 3 months ago, and now it's absolutely phenomenal. So I think that's the great side of it, but it's trying to go from all this fun stuff to actually getting it done, I suppose. Yeah. So that's kind of me. So Rich, anything on that one?
No, I just to build on what you said, I think the interesting part, and this is where I think time served is a real benefit to anything and learning anything, right? And that technology almost reinvents itself every couple of years, right? And it's great, and but a lot of the time the problem is not necessarily the technology, it's the people, right? I always remember somebody said technology is easy, people is hard, right? And like you say, getting people to want to change, whether you're a delivery organization that's kind of based on a date and therefore you don't really have a desire to understand the underlying problems, whether you've got kind of other incentives to try and hit around date or cost, or whether you're kind of getting sound bites that are quite shallow in terms of kind of solving the problem, right? And I'm sure we'll come back to this time and time again, right? But all organizations are going for test automation to solve all tests problems, right? And fundamentally, it isn't necessarily the problem for lots of test teams, right? There is something underneath it, which means they can't do test automation a lot of the time. And I think, a lot of these conversations, and coincidentally, a lot of the technology that Curiosity develop and work with customers on are kind of in a sweet spot of facing into a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the number one thing that happens, and I mean, this is some quite massive organizations you go in, and I think once people kind of open up, is that they're always talking about symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Rich is great, because he'll send me, I'm like storming away coding, trying to get a release out the door, and Rich will send me an article, and I'll click on it and think, oh wow, and it's, I think it's this sort of, it's this ability to be kind of in the weeds and also kind of up in the clouds as well, and I think that's what people are really bad at. There's some of you may have heard this story, but the question goes is why was Julius Caesar such a good general? Was it his tactics? Was it his ability to motivate his forces? Was he a good politician? And actually, the true story is that he got off his horse. So what he used to do whenever they went, and they said, right, we're going to, conquer Germania or wherever it was, they would set up a camp. He would get off his horse and he would go down in and check every single battlement. He would check every wire and he would check every single thing so that if they then got attacked at nighttime, there was no place for that for, his enemies to come through. And I always kind of remember that story. And I think there is a massive problem in IT in that we have completely and utterly deskilled managers. So, I am at heart a technician and I've run technology companies, and I code. So I know what the code is and I know the effect on the code. Now, if you are trying to convert yourself from a banker, and if you think about a bank is probably about 80 or 90% IT nowadays, You've closed all the branches. You've got a few sales guys. You've got a few brokers. You've got some marketing people. But it's an IT company. But it's run by bankers. So it is a lot easier to train an IT professional to become a banker than it is to train a banker to become IT. Now the problem, the effect of that on organizations is absolutely catastrophic. In that you then end up with these organizations that are making decisions on the technology, making decisions on the migrations based on probably maybe 10 or 20% of the knowledge. The people can be easily swayed because if you look at all the major vendors out there, and if you look at the growth of why we are where we are in the current set of technologies, is that has been fashion-led. So you start off with a fashion-led from a vendor. Oracle bought Java, Oracle thought, let's sell a lot of Java, right? Java can be an utter pain, and you can create utter carnage with Java. You've got to have massively strong code quality engines to check all that. And bingo, here we are sort of 20, 30 years later with just a lot of spaghetti Java, which people are now trying to. In fact, we just watched a fantastic webinar with Four Theorem, where basically they were talking about trying to kind of disentangle the code. Now, all those decisions were made, in the old days, you used to go to the golf course, Now, there are different ways to manipulate senior managers, but having more technical people in management, I think, is absolutely crucial. And if you look at, I think we were with, I think it was Santander, someone was telling me a story about, and what they've done there is they've picked some really, really bright young technicians and they put them on a fast track to go up into management, and they will be the managers of their peers probably inside, very senior managers, probably inside maybe 4 to 5 years. And they're looking to bring them up very high up into the organization. And I think that shows a degree of sort of, well, it's kind of new thinking really nowadays. I mean, being able to have the balls to be able to do that across the head of other managers who've kind of, I think when we worked for CA, if you wanted to be a product manager, you had to have an MBA. Why? What possible reason would you have to have an MBA? What the hell is an MBA? I mean, no offense to people with MBAs, but seriously, just go and run a chip fan for a couple of months and take a couple of YouTube courses and you got yourself an MBA. So what the hell has that got to do with being able to design a really complex and sophisticated product, which are way, way, way more complicated nowadays with all the advent of all the different technologies?
I think it goes a lot into what you were saying around historically managers have not been technologists, right? And therefore they've made management decisions rather than technology ones. And I think there's an interesting point, right, in that when we're talking to people, they're quite guarded around some of the challenges they've got sometimes, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting one, right? Because I think a refreshing conversation you will have, and kind of, this is probably why you like talking to me, right, is that we were aware of our challenges and we weren't scared to be transparent about what they were, so we could then start to face into them. I think it always dawns on me, right, that go back to 2010 when we first started working with you guys around test data management, and essentially how do you move yourself away from not using so much live data, right, and for development. And inevitably there was an underlying problem that we didn't have a capability to create masked or synthetic data around that, but there was an underlying challenge which meant actually there is something systemically challenging in the way that we're doing development today, which means we need to use live data for something, right? That live data was mitigating something, and the fact that we didn't know how certain elements of our system worked, that's a challenge for us, right? And I think that, live data aside, I think that all organizations will will struggle with complexity, right? And therefore won't have an absolute understanding of how their systems work, right? And therefore, that's almost the starting place for any organization, for any change today. But yet, I don't think organizations are in that mindset, and I don't think they've got the technology to face into that challenge either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I liked. There's if you guys are listening into this, hopefully you can look at Cynefin, which is spelled Cynefin, I believe. Yeah, which we put this slide up. I put it up on a number of times, and it basically has this sort of different levels of. It's like, it's the Donald Rumsfeld. The known unknowns, the unknown known knowns, the chaos, the chaotic systems. And there's one absolutely beautiful slide. Now, I did a presentation in Denmark. There's about I don't know, 40 or 50 people. I put it up, and I think there were one or two people that actually looked at this and they were familiar with it, but the other people weren't. And then I was getting people to try and put their hands up and say, well, which one are you in? And they were very, very cagey about being able to admit that. But, if you don't know where you are, how the hell are you supposed to know where you're going? Kind of concept, So.
It is. It's inevitable, right? I think there's a dynamic, and I don't know whether this is in the literature or not, right? But if you've got the Cynefin framework, which is on the one end you've got chaos, and the other end you've got simplicity, I think organizations making change are inevitably forcing you towards the chaos section, right? Depending on and that's all about complexity in your system and how much you understand the logic of your system stroke complexity, right? And I think, to me, it's inevitable by which, if you're, for example, got static documentation, right, or you're not doing any design thinking or architectural thinking or anything around that basis, you're gradually moving, whether that's through one change or whether that's through thousands of changes over 20 years, gradually you're getting to the chaotic space. And, this is to the point, as a leader of IT change, you either recognize that and put the steps in place to start to address it, to stop that chaotic kind of end goal becoming a reality, or you do something about it, right? And I think there's an interesting kind of parallelism, if you like, around chaotic equals monolithic big ball of mud to simplistic equals small iterative delivery stroke agile stroke DevOps, right? And it's interesting, as you go and talk to organizations who are trying to adopt those new ways of working, do they really understand the complexity of their systems? And I don't always see that, right? And I think there's an interesting point around agile theater, in that lots of organizations will do 2-week sprints and they'll do stand-ups, but actually kind of working ways of working haven't really changed, right? Other than they've chunked up their project plan from 3-month sprints into 2-week sprints now, but nothing's really changed, right?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, you've opened up such a massive thing. I think maybe we should probably come back to this as possibly one podcast, and maybe we'll come up with 10 points and then kind of attach those points. I mean, we were talking to, a well-known cloud provider, and we're talking to some of their project managers the other day, and I basically sort of said, so, is your life just getting features done? Yes. That was it.
Yeah.
And they just went back off and started churning features out. And within those 2 weeks, it's just a matter of getting those features through the door. My next question was said, do you at any stage go back and refactor? No, we don't have time, because the push for features in the product. Now, if you talk about technical debt, when you go under the covers of, once you've probably heard those two things, if you go under the covers and that system has been around for 2 years, you can pretty much guarantee that it will be chaotic. And those two questions alone will give you enough information, and you can look all the way up and down the tech stack. It doesn't particularly matter what it is. You can look at the back-end databases, and you will find massive levels of redundancy, tables which are called one thing, which are used in other ways, no commonality, no proper database design, which again we could talk about as kind of a sort of whole subject. So those two questions means that the organizational behavior are basically almost destroying their systems. And that is that kind of agile theatre, which I love your phrases. You come out with these fantastic things. So, this idea, it's basically a 2-week waterfall, and it's just hammering out these features. Now, with our product, I went slightly bonkers, probably drove the programmers certainly a couple of them, up the wall by basically spending 6 to 9 months of last year refactoring. And the reason for that is that I could see, I've been very experienced, I've done lots of these systems, and I could see in 2 years' time, we need our product to be able to cope with these things. Based on the architecture that we have and the way that we've designed those systems, we're not going to be able to cope with them. Okay. Now, it's more being able to move sort of to a kind of more like a graph database way of looking at things. Everything's connected to everything. There's many relationships. The ability to trail across systems, which we'll talk about separately. So now that refactoring kind of slowed anything. I think I did a product update where I basically said there are no product updates. We did a three month thing where I said, yep, we've done nothing. We've absolutely done nothing. However, sort of come December time, or November time, we then decided to load in a bunch of new features, which now sit on top of that refactored world, and we are going so fast. We have basically caught up in 2 months what 6 to 9 months stopped us doing, by being able to think a little bit out by being able to do that refactoring. And if you don't refactor from time to time, then you're in trouble, and you will build up more and more chaos, and then you end up with people saying, oh, we want a business intelligence system sitting on top. Yeah, because we've got all this fantastic data, we've got amazing data, we should be able to do something with it. And then you've got some poor person has then got to go back, and the problem is the data has morphed over time. If you look at the interpretation of the data, which is fine and it's perfectly normal, to be able to understand, say you took it nationwide, this was what a checking account looked like back in 1998, now in 2008, 2018. If you're trying to do business intelligence on top of that, there's a prism that you need to put them through to make them available. Now you need to understand that, and it's fine and it's perfectly okay to do that. But if you've got sort of, if you look at the links between things and systems now, quite often they're hidden inside JSON files, inside structures. Now that JSON structure may vary over time, and that's the thing that's tying together quite a lot of your systems. So how are you supposed to do a business intelligence system? So the thought of growth and everything must really now sit upon this sort of concept of better discipline. Thinking to the side a little bit, taking some time out. I think when I was working at CA, they would say, right, we do 3-week sprints. And I said, our sprint's going to be 9 weeks next one. And they completely freaked out. And I said, yeah, because we need to think. We need some time to think. We're going to prototype for probably 2, look at it, kick it around, and then we'll deliver. The next sprint's going to be 2 weeks because we'll be into delivery. And it was this sort of agile theatre about you just churning stuff out. Is so detrimental and causes so much chaos, back to Cynefin. So that just seems to be, unfortunately, very common.
It's the kind of the go slower to go faster kind of is the saying, isn't it? And I think the anti-pattern that I've seen in test teams is where there is no desire to do that refactoring. Is you'll see it in test teams where they've got shed loads of end-to-end testing, big end-to-end environments. So to summarize, basically this was around minimizing the blast radius, right? And so you get lots of test teams that have got lots of end-to-end testing. There's a hell of a lot of duplication in there. It's taking far too much time. It's costing far too much money. And the value of it is questionable at best, right? And so where do test teams to take a kind of an isolated view? Where do they take a step back and realize that actually their approach isn't where it needs to be, right? Where do they go back and look at what are the blast radius of the types of testing they're doing? How does that complement what the architecture is supposed to be doing in terms of loose coupling? I think that testing hasn't really evolved in the way that it needs to have to make sure that it complements kind of agile, good engineering practices, to be honest.
Yeah. I was going to mention this earlier, but so basically there was a fantastic company called Alza Leipzig, a German company. We did a bunch of work with them many years ago in the 80s, and I was so impressed with them. They were basically a bunch of developers, but they were developers, kind of multi-skilled developers, in that they would go to the users, they would ask the user what they wanted, they would develop the system and deliver it. But the advantage they had, or the management kind of let them have their head, and they realized that actually they didn't really have enough people to do what they needed to get done. So they spent about 10 or 15% of their time writing systems to support the development process. Now, 10 or 15% of their time. So they basically built their own DevOps system. They built their own testing frameworks. They had multiple. These were kind of the first days of kind of Windows machines spinning up, and they do that by turning them on, and then that machine would they would deploy the code to it, and they wrote their own code deployment things. Now, the result of that was that they actually created really high quality code at speed, and it was this idea of having 10 to 15% of their time using technology to support the development process. So lots of auto flags, lots of things being flagged up immediately. They put in enough kind of stability testing, so they didn't try and test everything. They would put in the most common stability tests, and anytime that there was a bug that appeared, they would put that into their stability test. So they weren't delayed by having to run 1,000 tests. They would run maybe 150 of them across 5 machines, and it was just well thought out. It sort of grew naturally, but because they were a small team, they probably were outproducing teams of maybe 10 or 15 times the size. And I would say that I have seen. I think probably test data management is kind of one of our specialty areas between us. I've seen a team of maybe 3 or 4 people outperform a team of 300 people. And this ability to think about what are you actually trying to achieve, how do I apply the right technology to do that, when does it apply, what kind of discipline and rigor do I need to apply on top of that technology to be able to make it effective, and how do I react when I get results from it, and if I do react, can I automate that reaction? Now, that was in the 80s, okay? I'll digress here. I went out with a couple of my developers sort of about a year ago and said basically, in the 80s we produced way more working code, which produced happier users, probably factors of 5 to 10 times more working code than they do nowadays. They fell about laughing. One guy, I had to pick him up off the floor. He just couldn't get in his head the idea that technology is going to move you. Technology gets better, therefore you get faster, blah 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 blah, is actually not true. Due to the kind of more complicated stacks that have arrived, we've kind of gone away from the sort of basics of what you're trying to achieve. Now, what you're trying to achieve actually is, if you look at 4GLs, some of you want to go off and have a look at 4GLs. 4GLs had about 8 statements in them. Had an if, a loop, it was about pretty much a set. You had a few things to do with forms, a bit of validation, and a report builder on top of it. But pretty much everything could be expressed in those 8 things. You didn't really have complex constructs with C inner loops and things like that. Now, the advantage of that is it was almost pseudocode, and the great thing about pseudocode is that when you sat down with the user, you could pretty much walk them through, in effect, a user story, and then the code would then get compiled into a more technical language, and it was kind of delivered much more efficiently and faster, which means that a lot of the requirements, when people say testing and coverage, which again we'll come back to, you're testing the requirements. A lot of people and technical managers say we're testing the code. No, you're not. So, you're testing the requirements. Someone has given you a requirement. You're testing those requirements. Now, the advantage of what we were doing, and the reason we were so quick, was that we were able to write this code in a kind of a pseudo language and sit with the users and basically say, well, okay, is this true? If this happens, then, is this always true? And they would say yes. And you say, well, that means that this if statement is going to go down there. And they said, oh, no. No, that wouldn't happen because, if the account has been put into abeyance, then we would go down this route. And you could almost code in front of them. And then that code would go live probably the following day. So now that was an ability to create a kind of much closer union between the user and the developer. You're almost developing with the user. We've got so many different layers now where and there's so many new heads. I'm the UX designer. I'm going to build these wonderful flowing user stories. I'm a techie. I just sit in my techie world. And the worst thing ever, that's is that they don't understand databases. The lack of understanding of databases and how you construct a good set of data, and how that is pretty much the solid foundation with which IT is built on. And again, this happened, the reason that this sort of happened, that there was this sort of deskilling of an understanding of databases, was DBAs were kind of, the collective noun for DBAs used to be delay. And the reason for that was that what they would do is they would take the table structures and they would try and understand them, and then they would challenge you on them. And there was a physical DBA and a logical DBA. Then outsourcing happened, sort of 90s. Oh, right. How much are these DBAs costing us? Oh, they're costing us a fortune. Right. What we need to do is outsource them. It's just a process which people can do, and they became technical DBAs. So they didn't understand this whole concept of trying to create a really good logical data model, and that logical model mapping into a physical data model. It sounds old-fashioned, but if you look at the wonderful world of APIs and Spring Boot and all the rest of that stuff, what you end up with at the bottom, and if you look at the tables and the joins that go on in those tables, you probably have to dig up some of the DBAs from the 80s and showed them, they would be not very happy with that as a constructive design. Now, there was a guy of my he still works for us, not in the technical capacity, Paul Blundell. Paul Blundell was an absolute genius at this, and he had a sort of innate sense of how to build tables. Fine, we've moved to big data, that's not a problem, it's the same concepts. And his tables were basically almost the solid foundation of everything else that sat on top of it. And it's, whereas if you have data structures which are misunderstood, poorly designed, don't join together properly, don't have lots of loose links between things, you can have loose links and it's fine as long as you know that it's loose links. And if people don't build those things and are constantly aware of them, and probably that's the one thing that is the most important thing to refactor. You can change the look of the screen, you can tidy up some code, but basically if you get that stuff right, then you're kind of sitting on a solid base. Now there's different ways that people can get around that. There's a company, a digital radio company in the States. They moved so quickly that they realized they had a problem with this. So they hired a team of people who they call data engineers. And all the data engineers do is they sit there understanding the data.
We could probably talk for hours about the subject. We should probably wrap up.
Yes. So let's just, okay, so hopefully you're kind of getting an idea of the nonsense that Rich and I can roam around and discuss. So I think next we'll probably pick a subject. I'm sort of tempted to maybe go with the GDPR one a little bit on that. Maybe we should get someone like Tom Price on. Tom's a bit of an expert on GDPR, and we'll use it as a springboard, almost your journey really, because I think that was kind of the journey that Nationwide went on, which was the worry about GDPR and then managing to turn that into an opportunity and not a problem, in that you managed to, in fact, kind of improve your entire development process because of GDPR. So maybe we should pick that as a theme next week, and we'll invite Tom along, who he's really good on all the legislation. He also knows all of the people that are being fined. I gave a presentation on this at Eurostar, which was, I think, one of the biggest presentations in attendance, which is somewhat depressing, really. So maybe we can pick that up as a theme for the next one. As we said, if you've got any ideas, feel free to send them through as we start publishing these out. We will listen. And if you're a bit of a genius and fancy a chat, maybe you'd like to join us on the podcast. Rich, any final words, and we'll say goodbye?
No, good conversation. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
The Why Didn't You Test That podcast. Thanks for listening. Show notes via the link.